So in the last video, we started talking about primitives and how they're kind of the building blocks of making 3D assets. So let's start talking about how we manipulate those primitives so that we can get a little bit more variation out of them. So I'm going to come up again, either to the poly modeling shelf here, which is a shortcut to some of our primitives, or I'm going to come to create, which is the top menu. I'm going to go to Polygon Primitives, and I'm going to pick again a cube, which is the second option from the top. I'm just going to left click on it. And you'll see that it has added that cube to the very center of our grid. Now, let's say that I don't want it at the very center of the grid, and I actually want it off a little bit to the side to start with. We have a couple different ways that we can interact with primitives, and in the future, different elements of this primitive. So I want you to take note on the side here on the left, we have move, we have rotate and scale. And if you look carefully, there's actually even a little tooltip there that tells you the shortcut key. So for move, it's W. For rotate, it's E. And for scale, it's R. And I personally like to put my ring finger, my second to little's finger, on the W, my middle finger on E, and my index finger on R. And what this allows you to do is very quickly do between moving, rotating, and scaling. So again, if we left click and have green selected box and hit W, you'll notice we get the move widget, or gizmo is what it's referred to sometimes. So widget or gizmo. And you'll notice when I hover my mouse over any of these arrows, they turn kind of a yellow color. And if I hover my mouse over any of these boxes, they also turn a yellow color. So if I hover over and I change the color, and then I left click and hold down, it'll let me, as I move my mouse left and right, move that object on that specific axes. So again, this is on the x-axis that I'm technically on. So if I hover on that, it lets me only move it that way. If I hover over the z-axis, it only lets me move it in that direction, y. And then what these little boxes do, if you notice, they're basically let me move it on two at the same time. So if this is x and z, which kind of imagine as the floor, if I left click and hold on this, it lets me not only move in x and z, but both of them at the same time, which is really handy if you want to move an object around without having to kind of move it one way and then another. So again, I want you guys to kind of practice holding down Alt, left clicking to rotate. You'll notice that they all kind of stay relative to the object. The last thing that we can do, and I don't use it too often, but it is important to know, if I hover over this blue box in the middle, you notice if I go off and on, it changes colors. If I left click and drag, this is moving it in what would be referred to as relative to the camera. So as you imagine, as I rotate, you notice this box stays where it is. So if I left click and drag, it's moving it across the screen relative to the camera. That might be a little advanced for now, but it's just another way in the future if you need to move something that you can handle. I'm most of the time always move based on these handles. And a little pro tip is you'll notice that if I move it through the grid, it'll kind of stop at that object. So this helped me kind of know if I'm on the ground in a rough way. So again, have fun kind of moving around. The next thing we're going to talk about is rotating. So either over here on the left side, we can click on this rotate button, or we can hit the E key. So very similar. You can see these colored circles that go around our object. So if I left click and hold on any one of them, my object can rotate on that one particular axis. And a little hint, if you actually look carefully, is over here in the channel box over on the right. You'll notice that when I rotate this, I'm actually updating the rotation value of this object. So if you ever want to be very precise, you could come over here, left click on it, and I could say like 45 degrees and then hit enter. And then that'll put my object in this new orientation. So if you need to get something very specific or anything like that. Now, if you want to kind of what is referred to as freeform rotation, if I just kind of don't put my mouse on any one line, but I just kind of put it over the middle, you'll notice it turns from nothing to like kind of a dark gray. And what this does is as I move my mouse around, it lets me move on kind of all the axes at once. And it's a little unwieldy, but sometimes if you're doing something a little chaotic or you're just trying to get something positioned, it can be kind of helpful. And then again, there's a loop around the outside, which is always relative to the camera. You'll notice that the circle that's blue is always facing the camera perfectly, while the other ones are staying relative to the cube. And that lets us, again, rotate based on the camera. So it's always facing the camera. So it's camera facing. And again, that might be a little confusing, but if you can imagine it as, yeah, it's just kind of rotating it almost two-dimensionally around that object. So if you ever get kind of in a position where this is all kind of gunked up, you can always, if you want to go back to what it was, you can control V to undo, or you could come over here to the channels box, and I can left click in a box and type 0. And if you don't want to do it one by one, what you can actually do is once you click and hold the left mouse button in one box and drag down, you can select multiple and then hit 0 and then enter. And that'll zero it out. And we can do the same thing. I'm going to left click, hold and drag down, and then type in 0 and click the enter key. So our object's all kind of back. Now, the last thing we want to talk about is scaling. Again, on the left side here, I can either hit R for the shortcut or click the button. And similar to kind of move, we have axes. If I hover, left click and drag, I can stretch it on one axis, stretch it on the other, or again, stretch on two axes is what the two boxes do. So have a little bit of fun here. Hit the W key, move it around, hit E to rotate to kind of an interesting position, and then hit R, and you'll see we can scale our object however we need. And this is kind of the start of how we make a lot of 3D models. We might duplicate this, do some other objects with it, but that should get us started on the ability to move, rotate, and scale our primitive objects.